Okay, so welcome everyone. Good morning, and good morning everyone online, and thank you everyone for being here. Um, Today we gonna have Hanson Chong, who is a researcher at the Economics, Trade and
A report put up by Talent Corp last year estimates that 18% of the Malaysian workforce in 10 strategic sectors will be exposed to the green economy, digital technologies, and AI technologies. Our paper focuses on the entire Malaysian workforce, not just a few sectors, and we looked at specifically generative AI technologies. The two research questions that we aim to answer within in this research project is, number one, how does generative AI technologies affect jobs? And who does it affect the most? What kinds of occupations, which demographic groups? And once you've identified the kinds of occupations and the demographic groups that are most exposed to generative AI, then what kind of policies can we put in place to best maximize the benefits from AI adoption, while at the same time limiting its negative impacts?
I mean, exposure is one thing, of course, no, but I mean, I guess you need to think hard about where are they going to be complements and where they're going to be substitutes, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of, I mean, I might be very deeply affected, but it only affects me in a positive sense because it's a great complement to my tasks that I do for lower order tasks. But so, yeah, my exposure is high, but not because I'm going to be substituted, but it's going to actually benefit me in some sense, right?
Yeah. Definitely. So in terms of our conceptual framework, we look at the exposure of jobs to generative AI in terms of its tasks. So this is a standard task-based framework that's used in the literature. We define a job as essentially a collection of tasks, task 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to N. And these collection of tasks in the task mix constitutes the entirety of a certain job. We then assign a automation score to each job task. So within this framework, how technology affects work, how technology affects workers, how it affects jobs is through the tasks that they perform. Now, a bit of caveat on what this automation score actually means in this context. We are not predicting the true extent of automation of these tasks because it depends on many other factors, right? Like the deployment of AI in these tasks, how workers use them, the incentives that businesses face to replace certain tasks with generative AI technologies. But what we think these scores represent is the upper bound estimate of potential automation, the in-principle automation of these tasks, given the semantics of what the task constitutes and the current capabilities of generative AI.
So the jobs, do they change, like in terms of in time? So for example, job 1, if I was like a manufacturer today, I use my hands, but tomorrow I use a robot, for example. And my job scope changes as it is introduced.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'll show this later, but in our framework, we sort of operationalize this using mathematical data. It's a cross-section of how jobs currently look like, rather than we don't really account for the dynamics of how job scopes might change. Yeah. We assess potential automation at the task level, but what we're really interested in is how jobs might change, right? So we need a way to aggregate from the task level back to the jobs level. And here's where we depart from the literature slightly. We use a counting method, where essentially we define the AI exposure index, A sub I, by counting the task in a job that is susceptible to significant automation. And we choose a threshold theta. We use the median in the entire sample, median of automation scores. We also conduct sensitivity analysis. We see how our results might change if this threshold changes. So by using this way of defining an AI exposure index, it's quite intuitive. It's just the proportion of task within a job that exceeds the threshold theta, exceeds the median automation score, divided by K, the total number of tasks in the job. To illustrate this graphically a little bit, you have different jobs in an economy. These jobs have different tasks. When a task has an automation score that exceeds our defined threshold, for example, job 1 here, all of its tasks exceeds threshold, then job 1 would have an A sub I, a AI exposure index of 1, indicating maximal exposure to generative AI technologies. This is in contrast to, for example, the last line in this figure, where none of the jobs exceed the threshold, then that would have the least exposure to generative AI technologies. Now, right now, everything is sort of on the air, but later when I give a specific example of occupations, it might become a bit clearer to some of us. So
Sorry, probably I stopped paying attention for 3 seconds. How is the threshold defined?
the threshold is the sample median,
Okay,
but we also conduct a sensitivity analysis looking at alternative thresholds, 0.2 and 0.5. So
Okay.
sample median 0.35.
and what is the period of your data? Like what kind of work you are looking at?
So it's just a cross section of jobs, how jobs look like, scraping information from the Malaysian standard classification of occupations.
And what year is this?
So it's the latest that's available on the website. I think the last time it was updated is
Okay,
2022.
perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So obviously there are some limitations to these task-based framework. For one, like I've already mentioned, the target of what these scores represent at the task level. They represent only the upper bound of potential automation. We're not trying to predict actual automation outcomes here. This depends on other operational factors as well. We are also agnostic to the kind of impact, the kind of exposure that we are looking at, whether because the job is exposed, most of its tasks are potentially automatable by generative AI, whether or not that augments or automates certain jobs, we are agnostic to that within our framework. We also do not account for sort of new task creation and other general equilibrium effects that might, for example, shifts in the labor market that might have consequences for our analysis. Nevertheless, the framework is very useful for us to identify which occupations, which jobs might be most exposed, and to formulate policy recommendations from that.
Another limitation is also risk. So, for example, you can land the plane, right? You can automate landing a plane, but you sort of need a person to land the plane as well. So the level of risk involved in your job is also, like how it affects other people, is also something that
I think that's definitely right. I think that has implications on the potential score of the task within the job.
How do you account for the difference in task diversity across jobs? Like, some of the more complex jobs, you have a lot more job tasks involved, whereas more simple jobs potentially have fewer task diversity, and so you have the denominator there is kind of different for different jobs, no?
Right. So we don't generate the task list for certain jobs. We just take as given the task list that is compiled by the by MASCO, by the Malaysian Standard Classification of Occupations.
It's asking about the denominator. So, but then because the denominator is different, then it basically a proportion, the percentage. So it'll always be the same. The metric is the same for each. It'll be as a percent of the total jobs, total tasks in that job.
Do you see any correlation between like jobs that have more task diversity versus AI exposure?
I think we haven't really looked at how the cage changed. I don't think the standard deviation is that much. So some jobs might have 4 tasks listed out, some have 9, and I think the average was like 7. So the diversity is not much. We don't see how that might potentially affect the automation scopes.
An example as well.
Maybe I'll wait for the example.
Yeah. So yes, I've alluded to. We bring this conceptual framework to the real world using data. We compile a data set of jobs and tasks in Malaysia using the 2022 MASCO. Information is on the website, so it's quite convenient to scrape it out. At the 6-digit level, MASCO provides a list of 4,000 jobs. And within these 4,000 jobs, nearly 20,000 tasks in total.
So, so you would give me an example, like, so let's say you take a job like a religious or language teacher. What are the tasks? How
should I make up the slide?
You saw the tasks. Super.
Describe the data a little bit more. At the 4-digit level, the primary analysis is at 4-digit level, there are around 492 jobs and 3,500 tasks. It gives an average of around 7 tasks per job at 4-digit level. And we also go to the 6-digit level because there's more granular information on skills, which might be important for generating policy recommendations on education and training. Right? Yeah.
How unique are the tasks from one job to another?
Some jobs there are certain overlaps between jobs. For example, you can imagine that the same task appears for different across different jobs. 3,500 for digit level is non-unique. It is quite a onerous process to assign automation scores for 20,000 tasks at the 6-digit level or 3,500 tasks at 4-digit level. So we follow some of the more recent methodologies in the literature to use sequential API calls to OpenAI's ChatGPT GPT-4o model to generate a score between 0 and 1. So the prompt that we use to generate this score assignment is as follows. We ask ChatGPT to generate a score ranging from 0 to 1 on a potential automation of this task in the next 3 to 5 years, given that the job is located in Malaysia, and this score should range between 0 and 1. So I talked about examples of tasks. So these are some of the scores that were assigned by the sequential API calls to the LLM model. So these are some of the top highest tasks with the highest automation scores. I guess these are quite expected. Typing written material, transcribing, recording, selling orders copy, these score among the highest automation scores, and these scores are generated by AI. In the literature, Ilondu and some of the other authors have found that the scores assigned in this way don't differ much from alternative methods, such as convening expert panels or getting industry stakeholders to rank tasks, the automation potential of tasks.
But you didn't do it for a subsample of your jobs to say, hey, okay, let's get humans to give scores to see what's the correlation you get between what ChatGPT does and what humans would say what automatable and not.
Yeah. So the robustness check that we conducted on the scores that are generated, so the main risk is hallucination by AI, right? The first time that you ask it to assign a score, it gives one score, but the second time you ask it, it's a different score. The robustness check that we didn't compare that to human assigned scores in our specific paper. But the robustness check that we did was to select a subsample of tasks, rerun it, cleaning the memory each time, 3 times, and see whether the standard deviation is large or not. And in most cases, it doesn't really deviate. Yeah.
You try with other software as well, like different AI softwares?
We have compared scores generated by the ChatGPT-4o model and also the Google's Gemini model. The scores are pretty much the same, but the rank is definitely the same. So it's kind of the task that we expect to be higher and lower. So the rank of these tasks doesn't really change with the model that you select.
It would be cool also to try with something like forget the name of the Chinese one, right? So kind of like, I mean, of course, what goes in is what comes out, right? So the training material is cultural specific, is built on people's, so it would be great to have a different cultural language context in which they've been trained to say, hey, you know, that's another more, I would say that's more robust than saying Gemini and ChatGPT show me the same thing, right? And that's a low cost activity for you to do.
Yeah, definitely. That's potentially some robust, but I suspect that the results wouldn't change too much because like the rank of the task probably stay the same.
Sorry, could you speak more on like, you know, what the previous literature argues why this method works? Because like, you know, I've used ChatGPT to do my own research, and then I asked for a bunch of literature, they come up with like, you know, some really obscure, and it really, when I try to confirm in the Google Scholar, there's no, like, you know, they just create. So
95% of the time, citation-wise, it just creates that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, you know, this could be subject to that concern as well.
Correct, definitely. I think there are 2 responses to this. And firstly, we're really relying on previous authors that have used this method. Some of them have compared they took a random sample of AI assigned scores and compared to human panels and find that there's no large differences. In fact, in human convened panels, there might be heterogeneity in one expert thinks this way and one expert thinks another way, and yet what do you take the average of what both of them think as well? So that's one response. The other response is, I guess, the ambiguity that arises from AI responses is valid when the task that's given to the AI is not specific. When it's quite open-ended, like what the AI is supposed to sort of answer you, but within our prompt, we made it very, very specific in terms of what is the output that we expect. It's a score ranging from 0 to 1, given these parameters.
And did you ask him, for instance, to generate rather than point estimates or probabilities for you, some kind of a distribution, right? Like saying, hey, what's the 95% confidence interval you would put on that? Because a mean is a mean, that would be kind of nice to see what is the kind of variance it generates to try and understand what's the level of confidence. Right now, you force it to give you a point estimate, right? But this depends upon how much you care about. Is it about the direction and the monitor, or the ranking of the task, or is it really about the probability, right?
A subsample of the task we ask it to generate, so we can create our own distribution of what are the point estimates that GPT provides. So instead of asking it to give you the variance, you can calculate the variance by doing the repeated API calls, right? So that's what we did.
But you need to repeat it 10,000 times, right, to generate a distribution.
Yeah.
I mean, you could do it, but I'm just assuming you asked it thrice and then you made a variance on it, but that's not what a distribution is, right? You need much more mass, right, to be able to generate it.
Yeah. So that's what we did. We did 50 times. That's conducted as part of superposition. What I'm hearing is perhaps within the analysis itself, we could incorporate the variance of the second.
Exactly, and I would say 50 is not like, even when I bootstrap standard errors, you would say to have credible estimates, you would want 1,000 repetitions of it. Yeah. So that I'm just saying, all of these are low-level tasks for you to incorporate easily into your framework in some sense.
Definitely, we could consider incorporating that into our analysis.
Cost constraints as well. I mean, the GPT-4 API credits are not super cheap. So especially when running the robustness checks, and repeated calls do rack up, the prices rack up. Yeah,
definitely can be done.
Yeah, can be done.
So the way I interpret the number is the probability that the task is going to get automated.
Right. And this is defined by.
What does it mean to be automated in terms of?
It's sort of ambiguous because it is what is. Sorry.
So at the task level, I think we can say for certain that the scores given are probability of automation. So there's this distinction between the task level scores and the job level scores. The task level scores, we can be more certain that automation is the outcome. But for job level, when after aggregation, even specific tasks that are automated, eventually the job itself might be augmented, or make to exist in some way. The task mix might shift. So I think there's in the task level, we can interpret it as automatability. But at the job level, we'll be a bit more careful, we'll be more agnostic towards the eventual mission outcome or not. I don't know if Matt wants to.
Yeah, I think that segues quite well into showing a list after aggregation, how some of the AI exposure index for different occupations look like. And just to zoom in on some of the occupations selected here, for example, for software developers, all of the tasks within a software developer occupation, these tasks are retrieved from Masco. All of them exceed the sampling median of 0.35, and hence we judge software developers who have a AI exposure index of 1, which is maximal. Indicates that all of these tasks are potentially automatable by generative AI. Again, with the caveat that we're not predicting actual automation outcomes, but in principle, automatability of these tasks, comparing the semantics of what the task currently represents and the current capabilities of generative AI. Yeah, also just to further illustrate how these tasks are, how tasks are assigned automation scores, and then how these scores are aggregated to the occupation level, to the job level, to create a AI exposure index. Judges are deemed to have low AI exposure, 0.14, because most of its tasks fall below the threshold that we have selected for potential automation of tasks.
Surprising, no? You would say, think about a civil law system, a legal code which are based on, let's say, France, or these are, in common law, you can imagine, even there, once precedents are set, judges are, especially low order judges, are largely going to follow it. I studied law and economics, and when I met lawyers, initially when we had discussions, I would ask them why. They would say, that's what the law says, ma'am. But my question was not what the law says. You would imagine that this is given for large language models, this must be their bread and butter. And you would imagine a much higher score for this, because that's something, there's not much, you read it, there's a clear precedent set, you are a large language model, you spit out what the decision should be, and that would, and why do we observe such a low probability for automation, according to you?
Yeah, definitely. The scores are subject to, these criticisms are valid. We also need to bear in mind that the tasks are generated within the Malaysian context. And even in the score assignment process, we did indicate that this is within the Malaysian context. So a lot of these scores are dependent on how the tasks are defined within the MASCO framework. But this still gives us, as an overview within the entire Malaysian workforce, who might be more exposed due to the current task compositions.
Sorry, jumping again, but I think it goes back to what Amir said about the stakes and the risks, right? So I think the reason why judges have such a low eventual automation score is that the stakes are too high for AI to completely automate that, even the single tasks within the occupation, because the legal ramifications and a bunch of ethical dilemmas creep in. So in that case, the framework does account for some of these risk elements that Amir has pointed out. Yeah.
Yes, and again, I'm just asking you just to push you a bit, right? Like, so imagine, I don't know if you know this very famous physician Atul Gawande. He's got lots of books, and in one of his books he describes how he comes up with a checklist of 10 things that the doctors are supposed to ask. This is in the context of, again, in Boston somewhere, and then he shows, when a lot of doctors don't follow, they feel like they can do much better. And then he runs a study showing that once doctors follow this 10 checklist, patient outcomes, I forget the numbers, are better by a very large extent, right?
Correct.
Similarly, you can think about the judges, like the studies of Kahneman and all that. You didn't eat lunch and then you go and make a judgment, your sentencing goes up by 10 marks. So all I mean to say is that in fact, you might say that, hey, the risk should go the other way, that in fact you want human judgment in some of these cases should be taken away once you have a clear structure. I'm just saying that because these are going to be out in the public domain, that I would like us to be more circumspect about how we push these numbers.
Sure.
Right?
I think we definitely acknowledge there's a lot of heterogeneity, even within a single occupation. How one doctor performs their task might be different, right? And I think that goes back to some of the caveats that we have laid out in the beginning. This is in principle whether these tasks can be automated or not. It represents the upper bound estimate of potential exposure of jobs to automation, and how these actually plays out. Of course, depends on how individual workers incorporate AI into their own workflow and different other operational aspects as well. But at this current juncture, it gives us a good idea of who might be exposed and how many workers might be exposed for a policymaker to generate specific. Okay, what do we do then, given that generative data is here, and it might have changed the way work is being done. So we mapped some of our occupational scores that we created at the task level, we aggregated it to the job level, and now we map it to the labor force using data from the labor force survey.
And where do doctors stand on your scale, or like say general practitioners? Where would they be on your scale according to your? Do you recall?
I think I can look up the data for you, and even we look at both the 4-digit level and the 6-digit level, right? What level of granularity do we stop at? Perhaps at the 4-digit level, you have a job for a doctor, but within the 6-digit level, it changes for specialists. But by and large, when we aggregate it back to the larger MASCO categories, I don't think there'll be much changes, because at the end of the day, it's an average of these different jobs. So 4.2 million workers, 28 roughly, our estimate is 28% of the Malaysian workforce are in occupations that are subject to the highest quartile of exposure to generative AI. Breaking that down, yep.
I actually think that the difference between a 4-digit and 6-digit might be really interesting to look at. Yeah. So I missed this conversation, so I'm sorry if you're going to repeat this, but it's going to be a good response to the questions from the judge about like doctors or judges. Like these are all distinctions of different fields. I think there's an assumption about civil, I don't know law that much, but certain cases being a little easier to think about precedents, but certain cases at the federal level or higher level, those doesn't apply anymore. So in this case, perhaps it might be really interesting to see like the 4-digit or the 2-digit and the 6-digit has bigger difference between your level of automation, because then it correlates more with the specifics of the job itself.
Yeah. That's a good point. That's also what we have done. We've selected 2 levels of granularity, one at the 4-digit level and also the 6-digit level, partly due to convenience because the tasks are already spelled out for these at the 4-digit level and the 6-digit level. And we do incorporate the 6-digit level analysis in some of the slides to come, especially when it incorporates skills that are required for each job occupation. Yeah.
And then I shut up. Yes. But
No, no, go ahead.
And last thing, I mean, Akash is not here, otherwise it would have been great because, for instance, the studies he's carried out, let's say, measuring doctor competence, right? How do they think about, they measure doctor competence and effort in low income settings, right? And what do? They basically look at whether when a person reports certain kinds of statements, they send in these standardized patients, basically how much time does the doctor spend and what kind of checklist questions do they ask, which a standard textbook teaches you across the globe when you're done. That you would imagine, given the level of low competence they find shockingly low,
Yes.
that these these automated AI should just be crazily good at like doing this basic diagnosis, right? Because the doctor is lazy, doesn't care, whatever might be the reason, doesn't know. Given the shocking low levels of competence in the settings they're exploring, you would say, hey, automation should be 100%.
Yeah.
In this first round of analysis by. All I'm trying to say is that given these kinds of pieces of evidence, that would be pretty cool that if you could show me saying, hey, these are the studies and look how we can map it to them, right? And that creates credibility for me in some sense. That's just a suggestion, but yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's a really good point. It's not something that we've really discussed either, but I see the point. I mean, I'm thinking about teacher quality and so forth. It'd be really cool to do. I'm not sure how you do it in a quantitative way though. But anyway, we'll talk about it.
Yeah, like Dornan just carried out the study in Ghana, right, where they provided AI tools to students, and these kids in 2 months learned as much as they do in standard 2 years. That's just mind-boggling, right, in terms of learning. But that just shows you teachers are just
Correct.
don't
I
know
think
anything. Right?
when we look at occupations more broadly, within occupations, there's definitely a lot of analysis that we can go more. We can do more. Like for doctors, it might be different. For teachers, it might be different. Yeah.
But I guess that is a caveat to our study. We assume that there is competent.
Yeah. I mean, like a couple of case studies where you unpack. You have the general report, but a couple of embedded case studies which bring in these kind of nuances, I think would just be very nice, in some sense of building like trust in this. How do we think about it in some sense, right?
And also goes back to what you said at the beginning. This is not just about substitutes. Like it can be like complementary to improve the specific professions. No.
Yeah, definitely. Within our analysis, we find that when we break down into the 1-digit level of the occupations, clerical support workers are the category that has the most workers currently in these occupations that are subject to the highest quartile of AI exposure, the highest AI exposure. In fact, 90% of the workers in the clerical support category are subjected to the highest quartiles of AI exposure. When we break down the occupations by gender as well, find that women are more exposed to generative AI, most possibly because of the construct of what these selection mechanisms of gender, men and women into occupations. Moving on to age, there's an interesting pattern that emerges here. So for prime age workers between the age of 25 to 44, they are most represented in the category of AI exposure, in the highest AI exposure category. While on the other hand, youngest workers from 15 to 24 are most represented in occupations with lowest AI exposure scores. So knowing that the kind of scores that we're likely to find given different tasks, this is likely because 15 to 24-year-olds take on manual roles that require little to no formal qualifications or experience, and that's why they are less susceptible to automation by generative AI specifically. But I think a worrying fact might be emerging, right? A worrying trend might be emerging where we find younger workers trapped in low-skilled roles, while entry-level cognitive jobs become increasingly automated, deepening age-based job polarization. If we assume that the exposure to generative AI might take a automation flavor rather than augmentation.
Can you actually do this by year? Because I think over the time, automation has increased. Like from if you go to McDonald's, there's no longer someone there; it's a machine.
Yeah.
So that has happened even prior to like the big AI breakthrough. So it'd be interesting to see if you do see the pattern that for the 15 to 24-year-olds.
Yeah, definitely. Given more data, we can definitely look into some of the dynamic impacts.
1 year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No
Maybe you can look into like different Masco's occupation years, because I'm sure there's like different series, right? You can take those, you can do the same thing, take the difference, see the difference, right?
Yeah.
If there's no change, that means probably there's, I don't know, maybe the math score thing hasn't changed as much. Yeah,
It's a point that you could be should.
but there's different years, right?
Oh, I have a question as well. In regards to the tasks that are automated by AI, I'm assuming that this is all for ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Or-
So that's taken by the opening AI report on
Right. So does that mean that you still need somebody in that role who knows this information to key in said information into ChatGPT to generate a response? Because assume you still need someone physically there to actually key in.
I mean, it depends on the dynamics of how AI is employed in the workplace, right? You can imagine even before these decisions often are not made by workers themselves.
Yeah.
Sometimes they are,
Mhm.
but by and large, what kind of roles still exist depends on employers and how employers choose to incorporate capital generative technologies into their production process.
So we use ChatGPT for this study, but the study is of the impact of generative AI
Yeah.
broadly, not just ChatGPT.
Oh,
So
okay.
it can be firm specific AI. That,
Oh, all right.
or, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I think our results show that the advent of ChatGPT challenges the traditional notion that aiming of getting higher skills, getting more educational qualifications is a route to job security. This notion is currently being challenged because we see that within different skill levels, in the high exposure categories, mostly dominated by occupations that require high skill or mid skill. And even within the highest quartiles of AI exposure, it's the post-secondary holders of post-secondary or tertiary qualifications that are most exposed to generative AI. But how this will play out, of course, depends on how workers incorporate AI into their workflow and how employers choose to deploy AI in the production processes. One final slide before we move into analysis of skills is we map out the AI exposure categories by wage deciles. In general, AI exposure increases with income, but at the top end of the wage distribution, there seems to be a plateauing effect. And we see that later when we analyze skills.
Sorry.
Yeah.
This graph and the previous one doesn't seem to correlate well. Here you have like income correlated with AI exposure, but then in the previous slide, it's the high exposures are mostly the mid-skill. Right, like most of the high skilled are in the medium high category rather than the high category.
Yeah, definitely.
How do you reconcile the two graphs?
It depends on the correlation between skills and wages, right? We'll show this in a couple of slides. What is the market value of a certain skill? We see this pattern emerging again. Introduce skills into the equation now. We look at there are 300 unique skills that are listed within Masco for the occupations. And what we've done here is take a skill, leadership, for example, which occupations require leadership as a skill, and take an average of their AI exposure index. And we've done this for all 300 skills and ranked them from 0 to 1. What's the average AI exposure for different skills? The pattern that comes out here is the higher order reasoning skills, such as problem solving and critical thinking, are on the lower end of exposure, while interpersonal skills are also on the lower end of exposure. For example, social receptiveness, coordination, and management.
What does problem solving mean?
Yeah. So we just take the skills as defined by Masco. We didn't really go deeper into defining whether or not, Yeah. So what we have done next is also to evaluate the labor market value of a skill by taking, again, for a certain skill, what are the different occupations that require this skill, what are the median wages, and taking an average of that. And we see the same pattern of polarization holding out of the middle wage skills that are most exposed to generative AI. So given this result, we now move towards considering different policy, a menu of policy actions that policymakers might consider, right? Given the advent of generative AI and kinds of exposure of different occupations to this new technology. And the two broad policy areas that we are looking at is one, in education and training, and social protection. So I'll elaborate more on education and training. This is the final part of the paper. We have fleshed out some of the policy recommendations. We're still in the midst of finalizing, so any comments would be very much appreciated as well. On education and training, we think that education systems should react to now the advent of generative AI. By incorporating findings from our skills analysis, we need to cultivate human edge competencies such as social intelligence, creativity, and critical thinking. In addition to these skills that might be less exposed to generative AI, we also think that in the future, we need to incorporate AI's related skills as well, and these depend on foundational skills in mathematics and logical reasoning, right? So for more specifically, within the Ministry of Education, we think that developing an AI literacy framework like how digital competency and digital literacy was developed in the last 20 years would be relevant. And within the higher education space as well, in the higher education policy domain, AI is a general purpose technology. In the occupations that are most exposed, we see that regardless of industry and sector, regardless of field of study, AI has the potential to automate tasks across different sections of field of study, right? So our next policy recommendation is on incorporating AI beyond just STEM education. So it's not just software developers that are most exposed, even though they have the highest automation, the highest exposure score, but other workers in other industries might be susceptible as well. Finally, given the types of tasks that are likely to be automated, we also recommend improving the labor market signaling of different credentials within higher education by allowing a framework for quality assurance of short courses and certifications for workers. These is policy recommendations that relate to the future workforce who are currently in school and higher education and training, but workers who are currently at work might also be exposed to generative AI. There are policies in employment training policies that can help as well. Some of them that we flesh out here is reducing barriers for workers to obtain upskilling, to upskill themselves and reskill themselves. Within the Malaysian context, we have the Human Resource Development Corporation. There are skills out there, but barriers to accessing these skills needs to be reduced. And it's not just on the workers' end. On the employers' end, providing incentives such as tax credits for reskilling workers will also change the equation on how exposure might look like. Like we've said throughout this presentation, exposure is agnostic to automation or augmentation. Much of how the actual automation outcomes or worker displacement outcomes will depend on the policy choices that we take today. And how can we incorporate incentives for workers, for employers to, rather than displace workers, rather than remove roles, to reskill workers instead. And finally, given the types of jobs that are likely to be least exposed, these are the occupations that have lower median wages, that are traditionally associated with lower skilled work. So how the next policy domain, the next policy area that we're thinking about is how do we improve job quality for these kinds of occupations. So these are the broad training and education and training policies that we're considering. One final slide now on social protection. I think this is a great opportunity for Malaysian policymakers to reconsider how protection is delivered to which workers, who are the most vulnerable workers. And some of our policy recommendations include extending voluntary unemployment insurance, providing targeted skills training, and in the long run, considering different models of funding social protection. So that's our research project, where it is currently right now. I appreciate a lot of the good comments that have come from this room, a lot of things that we can definitely think about, but just a few concluding thoughts before I hand the time back to Augustine. What we have seen is that the pace and impact of technological change has been increasing with this, and generative AI is the latest wave of technological change that will change the way work is done in the future. Automation has now encroached on the cognitive territory of tasks. Occupations that were previously thought to be outside the scope of automation are now exposed. We see preliminary evidence, at least, that existing job polarization, younger workers, women, demographic groups that are already at risk might worsen. So existing job polarizations and inequalities might worsen as a result. And policymakers need to balance the benefits, the potential productivity benefits from AI adoption with while mitigating some of its potential negative impacts. So that's all. Thank you so much. I appreciate really all the comment. Pass it back to the
Thank you, Hanson. It was very interesting, and we have still 12 minutes, and I'm pretty sure there are many questions, so feel free to ask. Also online, let us know if you want to participate, but let's start with Emir.
I really like the framework, the task framework. I really like that framing of jobs in that way. I think what would be for future research would be to corroborate, because I still don't know what automation is. So if you can actually connect automation with like our say or competence, something, some quantity of interest that is more, what's it called again? It's more concrete. I think that would be something that I would really like to see.
Right. Thanks for your suggestion.
Yeah, so just a follow-up of what Emir is saying, like, I feel, for example, in this presentation, I really like the framework, but then I feel that there was like a weird jump between the results from the analysis and the policy implications. I feel that the policy implications were just a bunch of, like a list of recommendations, like very generic, that doesn't really follow from the analysis. And I think to really have interesting policy recommendations, we need to go a little bit deeper on some of the details. For example, like Rajesh was saying, like, what is problem solving and why we think that ChatGPT cannot do that? Because problem solving is just knowing about a situation, having some alternative to solve that problem, and then decide. I mean, ChatGPT can actually be good at that. And for example, lawyers, why we don't think that ChatGPT can be good at that? So I think for that we need to go deeper on these definitions and what really means like this word, no, problem solving, social intelligence. What does that mean, and why we think ChatGPT or why we think humans are better or worse than ChatGPT? I think that will be
sure. Point that you can connecting the policy recommendations to the analysis a little bit more. I mean, it might be just because of the way that I presented it. Maybe I've made some false or misrepresentations in terms of the connections. But yeah, we will think about how we can link those to make that linkage a bit stronger in the final draft.
Thank you.
Sorry. I just want to relate directly what you mentioned, because this is what I, when I read, when you, I think too, in my personal, when you come up with new ideas or analytic, it doesn't have to directly give the policy direction, right? So again, this more policy implications, more even question to the government, to us, to researchers, what next, what actually this might impact on, and that's it. Just finish there. Don't trying too much to go directly to the policy. I mean, like social protection and all that. We know we don't even have to do the AI. The one that you list there, it's already out there, right? So it's better to better limit yourself to too much, and that is going to be more interesting, right? And it's one more trying to make a trigger question, even for ourselves. You don't have to give the solution or answers. So think more deeply about that, and then yes, just highlight that if we want to go deeper in the policy prescriptions, we have a lot that still need to be done, and that's it. Maybe that's going to be more interesting, and maybe this is the way how, if you want to present to the government or something, make them to also think, not just absorb, but they have to think too, together with you. Yeah.
I wonder if
no, I think that's a great response. But I mean, well, obviously, some caveats is that there's a lot more detail that exists in the working draft that didn't make it to the slide. Obviously, time constraints, everything. There's a lot more specifics on how it links to the results as well. Specifically, what we think on skill churn and what we think on the signaling value of certain credentials. There's a lot more detail. Unfortunately, it didn't make it. So I do think that's a great suggestion, though, and we will think, I think, more deeply on some of the connections that we have. And also, the last thing is that there's a difference in the framing, because this output is meant to be a policy paper, and that's the intention from the start as well. So I think the way we do it at public policy think tank like Access Malaysia is we focus specifically on eventually having some kind of recommendations, whether or not that can be food for thought or whether that's prescription. That's I guess we're framing it more as a food for thought kind of thing, and this is things to think about. But yeah, I think those are a great suggestion. We really thank you for that.
Just to add on, I agree with Augustine and what Ruby has said. Probably just something to consider is more specific policy recommendation, not broad recommendation. Like what you say, you have already done the analysis. The in between, probably you didn't present it. But I'm sure, like specifically tackling whatever they have, the process, that would be more, I think, more beneficial and kind of limit the scope of the policy recommendation in that sense. Yeah. Because I think this is a very specific thing. Of course, the list here is quite general in a sense, yeah. But I think the difference of this piece with the other kind of broader stuff.
I think one of the challenges we have is there's so much uncertainty in all of it. And this is guesswork. We don't actually know what will do to the labour market.
Yeah. So I guess it
how
depends on
how do you come up with policy recommendations in that setting?
Yeah.
And I think that we've done the default. We've gone back to how we think the social protection system should look, which is nice. But I agree. I mean, there is this disconnect.
So technically, it depends on what's the details that you have already in the draft that's not presented here. So if it's a very specific thing, then yes, it's very specific policy recommendation. But if not, then something like what Ruby has suggested in putting it as a question, I think that would be very helpful.
Really think about this, yeah.
Anyway, so I have two comments. The first one is on the methodology, because I think you're proposing a new framework, which is very interesting. And I think you want to contextualize it in the context of Malaysia specifically, which is very nice. But you're also proposing something new. So maybe one way I can see the two different directions of how you would want to frame the paper. One is like, this is a methods paper, like you're proposing something new, but then you'd want to contrast it to previous literature who's tried to do this, like, where they, instead of using like ChatGPT numbers, they use like routine task-based intensity. I'm looking at my colleague Adam, who might be able to comment more on this routine intensity. That could capture some of the possibility of automation as well, right? As opposed to this, like, whereas here, maybe one way to like sort of like corroborate how ChatGPT is coming up with this index numbers, like also ask them, like, when they come up with the numbers, like what are they thinking, right? Like in the context of Malaysia, like, how are they associating it with a certain number? So that's one on the methodology. And the second comment is on the policy aspect. So, I think everyone's made great comments on like, the policy recommendations as is or generic, but like, I think thinking about AI more broadly and how the policies are going to shape the landscape is, linking it to the old literature on skills bias technological change, which is interesting because, like, in the past, technological changes have, if anything, increased wage inequality, and precisely because, like, the higher skilled individuals are able to capture like the technical skills, they have, are able, take advantage of the technology. The question is, like, in this case, who are going to be affected? I think Rajesh and Agustin had made the point earlier. It would be useful to dig deeper into, like, what does exposure mean? Is it going to be a complementarity or a substitutability? And I think that would give you a more precise recommendations. Because one, if it's the higher skilled individuals who would be able to take advantage of this, the worry is inequality and rising wage inequality. Whereas if it's the lower skilled, you worry about them losing their jobs and them being completely replaced. And the question is, like, when you talk about upskilling and reskilling, like what the direction should be, right? Would this be like a level playing field? So everybody should learn AI so that they can take advantage of it, and then the middle skilled, as you suggested earlier, can take advantage of this. So, but then if you go on the other way, if the lower skilled are completely replaced, then the upskilling is like, they have to learn something else completely. And that's very different policy recommendations.
My presentation probably hasn't done the full draft in terms of thinking about my co-authors on just this. But that aside, I think I really appreciate pointing out the strand of literature on skill bias, technological change. In the full draft, I recall we do try to flesh it out a little bit more. But yeah, thanks so much for that. specific.
On the methods one, we're actually working on a different methods paper, right?
Correct. And also other ways of determining robustness of the scores that are generated by ChatGPT. So it's not just about hallucination, but also I guess it's a separate ID process.
And maybe just to add that some of the literature does go further in distinguishing between automation and augmentation. And we considered doing this, and in fact, I think we even did some of it ourselves, but the results weren't very satisfactory. And I mean, personally, I'm not fully convinced by those previous papers either. I think again, it's largely guesswork, so we were a bit conservative. But I mean, I take the point fully, you know.
For the presentation. I have some 3 points, and I think some of the points also already rehashed by some of the questions being asked. Because I'm an engineer, so when you talk about software engineering being automated, what I see is yes, automation goes there and it's exposed to AI, but there's a lot of spin-off jobs. You know, you have prompt engineering, which is a new recent job in the AI. You have human in the loop. You know, how do you explainable AI? So there's a lot of jobs that are created by AI that it's exposed there, right? It's exposed, but then you need any social protection for software engineers? No, you don't need any to protect them. I mean, your jobs are already created by the AI. So I mean, I don't know if you've factored that.
Yeah.
Then secondly, if you use ChatGPT, there's a lot of, I think, in the beginning when I started using ChatGPT, when it was new, it was less politically correct. So that feels like medicine. If you ask medical related questions, something related to gender, maybe law, it's trying to avoid, because maybe perhaps there's some legal, implication. Maybe someone uses it for something and then it's backfires and then they will sue the company or something. So that's something you have to factor in. Maybe that's why the law has instead of being a very high score, has a low score because it doesn't want to get into trouble, something like that perhaps. And then it comes to explainable AI. If you want to use AI for medicine, law, then the AI has to explain how it arrives at the results. It's not only telling me ChatGPT gives this. Okay, how? ChatGPT tell me, because you have to explain it. Okay, how the neurons connect. This neuron connected to this, it's connected to that, and this is how I arrived. It has to explain, and that's why it's more difficult. Despite it's easy, I mean it's automated, but then it's very difficult to explain the process. It's like as a black box model, it's easy. I mean, I did this and then but ChatGPT explain. That's another issue. Perhaps you need to consider. Perhaps.
Yeah, thank you for both your comments. In our framework, we didn't account for new types of roles, new types of tasks that may emerge when AI is deployed. And also take your point on the ethical dimensions of AI deployment. As mentioned, these exposure scores can only represent the upper bound estimate of the extent of AI enforcement on human labor. But then also, how is AI deployed? It's a question that's perhaps not answered in this research. Thank you. Adam.
Just going back to Daniel's point about thinking about the automation. So I think in 2022, we have a report that came out with a routineness task intensity, the RTI. It's in 2022, and we predict the RTI for 47 countries for different jobs, and they use different things like technology, skills, and globalization as a factor in predicting those RTIs for occupation. So I could share the paper with you, maybe something that you could consider in your framework as well, instead of looking at ChatGPT.
Thanks. Using existing rubrics. I think I forgot to mention, but in part of our robustness checks, we also compared the AI-generated scores with existing rubrics out there on the
Siemens.
Yeah.
So I've Dornan Siemens as an AI exposure indices, and there's a few other complementary adjusted indices based on that. We've done some preliminary robustness checks with those.
To compare our scores with those.
Okay.
Can I just ask one basic question? You mentioned that you wanted to introduce AI literacy to school, and I'm just wondering what you meant by that. Like, do you want them to know how to use prompts, or I'm teaching a class tomorrow, so I hope to what you want them to learn.
I mean, the details hasn't really been fleshed out yet, but these are just preliminary policy directions to have towards. But happy to have a chat on that.
Because it just seems I don't want students to learn. I want students to learn something.
Maybe we can share some of the draft review with one of the extra details, and we can have a chat about what your suggestions, because since you are obviously a teaching professional. But I think the idea here is that we haven't conceived of I mean, in the past 20 years, like ICT in schools have been obviously deployed quite successfully in the past 20 years. But now that there's a new frontier technology, I think the idea here is to see how we can also incorporate that into basic curricula across schools. In the sense that obviously we've spent a lot of time on ICT and computers, and myself, when I was in school, we did a computer class. But I think that the sense that this new technology has not readily been incorporated in curricula yet, and we're trying to see how it can be mainstreamed into many of the curricula across, starting from primary school to secondary school. Yeah, I guess the mainstreaming is the main aspect.
It's just using it during.
Well, so using it during learning, but you can also conceive of a specific class. For example, I don't know what curricula you guys had in school, but for us, we had a computer class, right? So in the sense that there's both a specific class for that, but also mainstreaming across the different subject areas as well. That's what we conceive.
Yeah, and I guess using it as a tool, so for academic research, obviously it can save a lot of time, but it can also lead you down the wrong path entirely. So
yeah,
if you understand it.
And we also conceive of different aspects as well. AI ethics is one area in which that's, I guess, under focused by many economics and social scientists, but I think AI ethics is a key component of the education aspect in schools as well. We conceive based on our.
Okay, we're doing that already, so I think we're good.
Perfect. So it's already 12:05. So let's conclude here. Thank you very much. Very nice. And if you can help us just scanning the QR code, it would be great. And see you next week. Emir is gonna present next week, no? Okay. Perfect. So see you next week, and thank you very much.